Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 here. So what I'd like to move on to now a little bit after a quick recap are a couple of artists in particular who were and continue to be incredibly popular up until today, in large part because their work, although being quite interested in modernist ideas and abstraction, still retains a great degree of recognizability and therefore is, let's say, I don't want to say less kind of cutting edge, but certainly something that is compelling to people who want a subject matter that they can recognize, something that they understand what it's about rather than something that's, let's say, like a Max Weber, where everything's quite abstract and pretty difficult to tell what anything is. And those two artists are Georgia O'Keeffe and Edward Hopper. So first of all, let's do a little recap, because I know it's important if you've never had these ideas before to spend some time kind of clarifying. What we're talking about so far are basically two different kinds of major overarching goals or modes of abstraction. On the one hand, you have art for art's sake ideas, where the goal is, even if your subject matter is recognizable, even if you're like, frankly, all the way through Whistler's work, where it's a woman, but he calls it Symphony in White because supposedly it's all about the tonalities of white and the way that they harmonize, or Nocturne in Black and Gold, which we just looked at. Yeah, it's based upon a subject matter that, I think you can still recognize it, but what is his goal? What is he trying to do in his art? And in art for art's sake, or art that really thinks of the value of art as being intrinsic, that its goal is just to create something that is pleasurable, something that they used to call beauty, but for reasons gone into by Clive Bell, they now call significant form, and the pleasure called an aesthetic emotion. Their goal there is just simply to create that pleasure. They're not trying to express anything. They're not necessarily trying to communicate anything. And there are very few artists who are way, way over there on that end of the spectrum who say, the only thing that I want to do is basically create pleasure through my works of art. Henri Matisse is a kind of famous example. On the other end of, let's say, the extreme other end of the spectrum of abstraction, if we were to think of this as a long spectrum, are artists who are really interested in basically expressing an idea or expressing an emotion or something that is intangible that doesn't have any visual equivalent in the first place. And those artists then are not beholden to likenesses at all, and they're not interested just in creating this aesthetic pleasure for us at all. What they're interested in doing is using the formal elements as if it's a kind of universal language that can speak to us through the way that we respond to a particular kind of line or a particular quality of line or a particular type of composition or color or what have you. A lot of these artists were influenced in the background by a famous text by a Russian-born but basically practiced in Germany most of his career, artist by the name of Vasily Kandinsky. Now, people like Marston Hartley actually exhibited with Vasily Kandinsky and Franz Marc in Germany as a part of their one of their movements was called the Blue Rider, or Der Blaue Reiter group. And the important thing about Kandinsky, and I gave you an optional reading by him, is that when he wrote this text that's usually translated as called Concerning the Spiritual in Art, but there's a little trick here. In German, the term Geistige, which is translated here as spiritual, really means intellectual as well. What he was trying to explain is the way that these basic building blocks of any art, but he was primarily talking about painting because he was a painter, have the ability to communicate to us directly, almost phenomenologically, perceptually. Not a matter of convention, right? What he was basically saying is, a diagonal line, because it is diagonal by its very nature, we as human beings will respond to it in a very predictable way. We will respond to it as thinking of it as dynamic, as full of movement, as implying action. And then he went on to say, if you want to give even more action, let's say you have a diagonal line, but it jigjags back and forth to add even more elements of energy to it. If you want to create something that's calming and soothing, use a horizontal line or even a curvy horizontal line. Now, there's no hard and fast rules to this language of form. And that's what he was trying to work out in concerning the spiritual and art. But he did say that there was a universal language of form that we as artists had defined. So that, again, it's not just line, it could be a color. Think of it this way. Let's say you see red and you think, well, red's all about passion, right? Red's, I see it associated with Valentine's Day. I've seen enough paintings of the past that I know red's associated with passion or big emotions. Now, what Kandinsky would say is the reason that you're understanding it that way is associated with passion is symbolism, which is a matter of a cultural convention. So that when you look at red, you know, because it's associated with Valentine's Day, that it's supposed to be about love. But that's something you had to learn. For these modern artists who are associated with expressionism, what they're really searching for is the way that beyond cultural conventions, people will predictably respond to a particular color, a particular combination of colors, a particular line, a particular kind of way that that line is drawn, the combination of all of these things together. And their big goal is to think of this as a universal language beyond conventions, so that their belief is that just because of the way the human mind's set up, or because of the amount of energy it takes for an eye to travel along a line that goes like this, energy will be instilled in every single human being. Because of the way that they're just starting to learn about the science of this now too, the way that colors affect us, but just because of the way that a wavelength works, we will respond to reds predictably as more energetic, as colors that feel like they're expanding outwards towards us. Whereas blues, because of their wavelength being longer, will respond to them as if they're contracting, as if they're receding, as if they're calming, right? So they're thinking of each one of these elements of art as communicative in a perceptual way, not in a conventional way. And that's key. It's not that you have to learn it. We respond to them because they affect us in a fairly predictable way. And then if you think of each one of these formal elements as being like a word, the work of art is an essay in which it puts together each one of these qualities of different formal elements so as to communicate some bigger message. So way over on this end of the spectrum, then, you might think of purely expressionistic artists who don't care what something looks like or how closely it resembles something in the real world. They tend to be inspired by feelings or ephemeral, intangible kinds of emotional states or qualities of things that they experience in the world that they can't put into words. And all they want to do is communicate that through the language of form. Somewhere in between those poles are most of the artists that we're seeing, including George O'Keeffe and frankly even more so someone like Edward Hopper. So those are our two big kind of modes. Formalism, art for art's sake, intrinsic value to art. The other one is using the basic building blocks of art, so it's starting points of formal elements to communicate or express or evoke something. Most of them are over here on the I want to express something, but they're in the spectrum in between the two, meaning wanting to express something while still having a likeness, or wanting to express something but still being interested in creating beauty or some kind of harmony for us. Then the big trick becomes, what are they trying to express, in as much as we know that, and how do the qualities of the formal elements and the way they're combined match up to what they're trying to express? How are they expressing what they are trying to express? So let's go into that in a little bit more detail. George O'Keeffe, most people are familiar with at least a couple of works of hers. You may not know the backstory. I'm going to keep it fairly brief. She basically kicked around learning art over the course of about 8 years before she had any kind of breakthrough. She came from a kind of lower middle class family went through a lot of hardship early in her life. She started her artistic career in Chicago at the Art Institute of Chicago, which is still around today, learning the basics of anatomy, as everyone was supposed to learn, but probably being shut out of some of the elements of that as a woman. She then came to New York and studied at the Art Students League. The Art Students League is a little bit like an artistic co-op where major artists would come through as teachers. You tend to be a little bit more cutting edge, not as conventional as places like the New York Academy of Design or the Philadelphia Academy of the Arts. She then came in contact with, through Stieglitz's gallery, some of the major modern artists we've already looked at today and was impressed by their work. She read Vasily Kandinsky's writings. She, at a certain stage, and again, I'm cutting some parts out because she went off to Amarillo, Texas for a while and taught there, and then she came back to New York. She ended up in South Carolina during a really difficult time in her career, right after she had taken some classes from Arthur Dow, who was an art educator, and learned some of his theories about some of the social usages of modern art. She goes down to South Carolina and she starts experimenting with these things. She got pretty famous because, of course, she marries Alfred Stieglitz, exhibits in his gallery a number of times. He promotes her work, and she was an exceptional talent in her own right anyway, but it doesn't hurt to have that kind of exposure, so to speak. So in this moment that she goes to South Carolina, and after having read Vasily Kandinsky's ideas about how the formal elements of art could be thought of as a universal language of form, she reads and is taught Arthur Dow's ideas through one of his peers. She doesn't actually take classes from him, but that's not all that important. Just know that they come from this major player, Arthur Dow, who's an art educator, who, along with a man by the name of Ernst Fenollosa, who was a scientist as well as an expert in Asian arts, had developed this theory that becomes known as the Dow-Fenollosa system, or Dow-Fenollosa theory, in which what they tried to do is say that, and this was a big problem for a lot of people in the U.S., that modern art actually had a social utility to it. See, here's the thing. A lot of critics in the United States thought that modern art was esoteric, idiosyncratic, that, yeah, it was maybe you could imagine that an artist was expressing what they were feeling in their art, but who cared anyway? It's just that individual's own personality expressing itself, and it doesn't connect us together as a community in the way that the supposed social values of something like classical art or even genre-based art could. Now, these two characters, Ernst Fenollosa and Arthur Dow, said, no, here's the thing. Modern art, by focusing on relations of form, is able to do what classical art did in particular periods, but at a much more kind of abstract, universal level. Or another way to put this is, imagine that a classical work of art, let's say Michelangelo's work of art, is trying to communicate the values of universal, elements of Christianity, frankly. But it's communicating those through a recognizable form that's very closely connected to a very particular religion. What Fenollosa and Dow said is that abstract forms of art and the relationships between the different elements can actually evoke those ideas of community or connectedness or harmony between disparate parts in the same way that maybe Christianity did it, but without the trappings or without the conventions associated with one particular way of thinking, Christianity, for instance. After all, Fenollosa has done a ton of reading of Eastern philosophies. And what a lot of these people are thinking is, beneath all religions, there is this kind of common element of humanity, and abstract forms of art which get to those essences, but through the formal essence of painting or drawing or what have you, are better able to express or communicate these ideas of communality or universality than one particular set of religious beliefs could, or an art form that seeks to represent through various stories of the Bible those religious beliefs. I'm going to take another run through this and say it this way. By this standpoint, a lot of people are absolutely thinking that underneath all religions, right, existentialism as a basic kind of idea has been out there for a while, underneath all the religions are human beings responding to various insecurities or aspirations, and then they give form to those aspirations or those common beliefs through a narrative that becomes a religion. But beneath all religions is this kind of common thread of human aspirations, human anxieties, human fears, and so forth, right? So beneath it all, an essence to all religions. Beneath all of these paintings, so the formalist critic said, is an essence of a combination of form in a particular way so as to produce beauty. Then come people like Ernst Fenollosa and Arthur Dow who say, listen, I want more from my art than just expressing beauty. What if instead of calling this kind of essence of the basic building blocks of painting or art, instead of calling that just about beauty or, frankly, again, an aesthetic emotion or significant form, what if I say, beneath it all, an artist can create arrangements of form in such a way as to express the common core of humanity or harmonies of human beings who are different. So here we see Georgia O'Keeffe kind of working her way through this in these various charcoal drawings during this time period where, by the way, her mother is dying of tuberculosis. She's isolated off in South Carolina, teaching at a girls' school that she frankly doesn't want to be there. She doesn't think that she's ever going to be a great artist. Her largest aspiration is basically to be a teacher, and she's experimenting. And so here you see at least three different kinds of elements of form. These long curvilinear lines, right? Two repeating themselves next to curvilinear shapes, one after another. So different and yet made to harmonize with one another. And the same thing over here, quite different jagged lines that nonetheless seem to rhyme the shapes of these round lines. And so you get a kind of harmony or unification of at least three disparate elements. And I'm not even talking about tonalities of white and black and kind of the absence of those forms. That she's saying, let's say this is an abstract equivalent, or rather a model for human difference still being harmonized or unified by common cores of humanity. Or, again, let's say this form here, what is she trying to communicate here? Well, something about a long diagonal form, very strong, very assertive. Is that even a positive shape or a negative shape next to the curvilinear shape behind it? Is this case she's trying to say this is about harmony? I don't think so. It doesn't feel like it harmonizes at all. It feels like the exact opposite of what she just did. A big, dynamic, strong, bold shape overpowering and stamping out a softer, let's say, organic shape or series of lines behind it, right? The opposite of what we want in society. And she does this, just kind of experiments of all these forms during this time period. One of my favorite of the bunch is this really simple one called Blue Lines from 1916 that was created, again, as her mom was in her last years with tuberculosis. And you see these two forms that at the bottom seem to be paralleling, and one's growing and the other one stays kind of spindly and then drops off and then tries to get going again, and you're not sure which way it's going to go. It's an abstract equivalent for some kind of feeling or some kind of state of her life. Now, when she is doing her schooling, she comes back in 1916 and meets with, she goes to the 291 gallery and she meets with Stieglitz, and she starts taking more classes from fellow teachers of Arthur Dow. One of the things she really, really gets back into is Vasily Kandinsky's writings and his philosophy, because they're being taught by these colleagues of Arthur Dow that she's taking classes in. So this is a work that's called Music, Pink and Blue, and let me just take you through where this comes from Kandinsky. Kandinsky famously would use that musical metaphor for his own art as well, but he added something else to it. He once said that he went to a Wagner concert. I don't know if you know Wagner, but if you don't know Wagner, play a little snippet of his music, like, whatever it is. And it's just big, powerful, loud German music full of leitmotifs that are basically about characters, in the abstract equivalent of music. And he said he was listening to a Wagner concert and he had the experience of what he called, what we all call synesthesia. Synesthesia is the ability to have a kind of concomitance of sensory experiences, so that the best way to put it is that, let's say you're listening to music, you can actually see it. You have visual qualities. Or it could be something like you're listening to music and you could smell it or you could taste it. Now, generally speaking, this happens to people who have some type of brain trauma, but it's also been documented in other people. And what Kandinsky believed is that this showed you that at a very deep level, there is like what he called the level of the soul. There is this kind of communality that if a work of art really, really is powerful, it will go deep inside someone and basically be understood or intuited by them without their mind getting involved at all. So from this comes the idea of abstract equivalence in terms of you could create a visual form that would speak to some kind of deep kind of philosophical need in human beings. From this becomes a famous exercise that's still used today in art schools, and that's to play music and have artists turn that into a visual equivalent. And so here you have it. Music is being played, the students sit around and they try to turn into a visual form the music that they're hearing, right? So, whatever you think right now, and it's, again, it would be nice if all visual form had some kind of basic universal language, but it's probably not the case. Whatever you think about that, I think it's clear enough from looking at this form that what she's listening to is kind of soft and melodic and something that builds probably and something that has repetitious features, right? So let's say I'm going to read this and I say, there's the silence of the moment before the sound starts, and then the sound starts and you've got kind of one sound, again, repeated from another instrument coming from the other, part of the orchestra, and then over here another sound that's slightly different in value mixing with that, and then an even stronger sound of the red form. I mean, again, I'm just completely making up how these things are pictured in visual forms, but you get the idea. I mean, we can look at this and think of equivalence in the sounds that she was hearing. We certainly know in looking at this, I think, that it's not like jazz that she's listening to, that it's not like hip hop or something, even if it were around at the time. It's something that is about harmonies and crescendos and one thing building on another in a kind of soft, organic way. So she uses these soft pastel colors that have that kind of feeling to them. She uses organic shapes that are repeated to get to that idea of one thing building upon another. But you also get this feeling of things building up and changing from white to kind of a light blue to a red that is punctuated at moments of a more intense red, as if there's some kind of big sound coming through, right? That's what she's doing here. That's what she's trying to achieve. And she did this, again, these are all exercises on the same thing. It's another music pink and blue. Or in this case, a totally different thing, blue and green music. Now you know, again, that whatever she's listening to now is likely not the thing she was listening to when she was painting music pink and blue, right? Something else is going on here. It's a different feeling to the music. You're trying to express your, again, experience of a musical concert or sound through the abstract visual equivalent of painting. And you're doing things like taking really strong forms, rectilinear forms, things that are diagonal, that have that feeling of movement and strength, and you're combining them, or let's say rhyming them with kind of things that have different feelings. Long, continuous, squiggly forms here, one after another, or these, let's say, more complex forms, same kinds of organic quality, same kind of curvilinear comfort in them, but something that is enveloped by these stronger forms around them. Or, again, just think of this. What an abstract artist is doing is trying to communicate something that is a feeling or a thought or an experience, so something that's interior. And they're trying to do it not through words or something like symbols that are conventions. They're trying to do it through the visual form of their paintings. Here you've got a work by George O'Keeffe that is called Blue Number 1. What do you think she's trying to communicate here? What does it make you feel? Why does it make you feel that? We've got this kind of blue form all twisting up in on itself. It looks to me like something that's full of anxiousness. It feels almost like, to me, like a stomach cringing up. Blue, of course, contracts away from us, and it makes it contract even more. And then surrounding this is that kind of black form that adds whatever quality that adds for you, right? The trick here is always what we try to do in art history or in criticism is sometimes thankless and certainly never going to get at everything that's in a painting. And that's to take what we see in a painting and try to translate it back into words in some way. But an artist is really thinking, a visual artist is really thinking, if I could say it in words, I wouldn't need to paint it. I'm trying to paint something, a feeling or a thought or some kind of intangible emotion that I can't put into words. I can only put it into this visual form. So we're always only going to approximate that. And in this class, don't worry about getting it wrong. Just point to the elements in the painting that you feel are doing or having this particular effect and run that by, let's say, your roommates and say, hey, does this sound like it's plausible to you? And as long as you're doing that, you're doing fine. I want to read you this quote by George O'Keeffe from the reading that you had. It's kind of fundamental to her own form of expressionism, right? She wasn't very good with words. She had these feelings inside that needed output in her paintings, something that, by the way, Vasily Kandinsky called inner necessity. These things, these really powerful things that crop up in us that we have to find a way to communicate. And she put it this way: I feel that a real living form is the natural result of the individual's effort to create the living thing out of an adventure of his spirit into the unknown, where it has experienced something, felt something it has not understood, and from that experience comes the desire to make the unknown known. By unknown, I mean that thing that means so much to the person that he wants to put it down, clarify something he feels but does not clearly understand. Sometimes he partially knows why, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes it is all working in the dark, but a working that must be done. So I want you to think about it this way too. I'm sure every single one of you at some point in your life has had a big, powerful feeling or emotion or insight. And to clarify that, to make sense of it, to kind of take it and turn it around and look at it, you have to communicate it. You have to represent it. That's what these artists are trying to do. Of course, they're all trying to communicate slightly different things in different ways, but that's what expressionism really means. So one of the things that starts to show up in her art, she's still doing the same types of things, but this is gray line with black, blue, and yellow, is that you start to see these forms over and over again that are, and by forms I mean colors and shapes and lines and so forth, that begin to be associated with her being a woman artist. Now this drove her crazy, but at this time, of course, we have already seen that the gender kind of binaries that exist in the world between masculine and feminine are hard set, and they absolutely influence the way that people think about artists' work. Remember in your reading, people had pointed out that, or made the assertion that someone like Charles Demuth's work, which I don't see at all, was too feminine. And I think they're talking about kind of his early watercolors. But in any case, to deride a male artist, you would call him feminine. And to really play up the strengths of this woman artist, you would say, wow, what she's doing is expressing something intensely feminine, something that is a woman's insight. And primarily what they were talking about when they looked at these forms early on were organic shapes. So think of organic shapes versus geometric shapes. Organic shapes or forms relate to nature. Women had always been associated with nature, men with culture, men with the city. And of course, things like pastel colors, soft lines rather than hard lines, things that were understood to be over here on the feminine side of the gender spectrum. Then, combined with this, the idea that, frankly, a lot of the shapes that she created looked, well, slightly, let's say, like female genitalia, and you'll see this again in the flowers. People started reading that into her art, right? That the essence or the difference of woman was, basically vaginal forms or vulvic forms that are associated with women's essence. Women are creating from kind of the core of their being, therefore it's going to show up in this form. Now, when she heard this, she was, I wouldn't say mortified, but really upset. Like, first of all, don't call me a great woman artist. She understood that that would marginalize her, right? You're not a great artist, you're a great woman artist, that qualifier. And then, although she was trying to express something profoundly and importantly a part of her, to reduce this to the representation of, let's say, something that's analogous to female genitalia really bugged her quite a bit. However, I will say this. If your art looks suspiciously like female genitalia all the time and people are seeing that all the time, what are you going to do? If they recognize or see an analogy between the visual form of your art and, female anatomy, you're kind of stuck with it. You got to deal with that as an artist. So think of it this way, too. This is just one example of a series of work she did for about a year of the New York City skyline as that skyline was changing. It's called City Night. Tons of critics came out against this. I find them great works of art. They're very visually appealing to me. Frankly, all of the photographers of this time, including Alfred Stieglitz, are taking photographs of these high-rises in New York. It's kind of everywhere. She's painting it, but the reason the critics didn't like it is it's too masculine, and you're a woman artist. It's an urban space, that's masculine. It's hard edge forms that are geometric, that's masculine, right? They're very strong forms instead of those, kind of softer forms that we've begun to recognize as typically George O'Keeffe. And they talked her out of it, believe it or not. So she moved back to, again, those organic forms. And again, these things got read over and over again with lots of sexual innuendo, what she called the psychological reading of her works of art. And of course, everyone is reading a ton of Freud at this point, so everything is based upon sex if you look at it closely. This is called Jack in the Pulpit, number 4. They're close-ups of flowers. And here I want to add another thing. A huge component of the most famous George O'Keeffe's works are subjects that are derived from nature. And if there's one kind of continually cropping up thematic in her work, it's things that we have already talked about in this class. The idea of pantheism, for instance, right? The idea that God or some eternal spirit exists in all things. You're going to see that in George O'Keeffe's work, but in an abstract way. Or the idea that there is some kind of essence to nature, right? Something in nature that is its essential quality, which maybe before we called pantheistic and identified with God, but she's not necessarily that straightforward, religious with her pantheism. Instead, she thinks, what is the essence of nature? What is the generative principle of nature? And so you'll see in her works all the time, like a close-up of a flower, you get a stamen down here, and then you get, right, so down here the stamen, then you get the petals. Most of you know that, of course, all flowers have actual masculine and feminine sexual parts. And, of course, that shows up here because what is nature? It's something that is constantly growing, constantly coming alive, constantly, blooming, constantly full of this kind of generative principle of something that is about life. A red canna here, another close-up of a flower. I want to talk here about something else that's going on in her work. And again, you can just kind of build these things upon one another. One of the things that's very common in Georgia O'Keeffe's work as a way to generate abstract, beautiful form is to get really up close on something or look at something from a kind of unusual vantage point, as if you're way down on the ground looking up at something or way up close. And many people have pointed out that she's probably being influenced by photography at this stage. Photographers were now perfecting the snapshot. Instead of setting up a tripod, they're kind of going around and just taking quick shots of things. And often this would give you a weird angle on something, or you could get up really close on something. And a lot of visual artists start to say, wow, that's kind of cool. I will do that when I paint a picture. I will push myself up into the picture plane so that I'm right up next to this flower, and it will reduce that form from something entirely recognizable to a series of abstract shapes and so forth that are the expression of the essence of this flower rather than a very accurate rendering of what it looks like per se. Black iris here, again, you can kind of see the way that these things would be associated with female form. And here's where I get into the pantheistic side of things, in particular, ideas that we've already covered when we were looking at landscape painting. In the late 20s into the 30s, because of a series of hiccups in their marriage, Georgia O'Keeffe starts to travel out to the Southwest in areas of Texas and New Mexico in particular, where she'll eventually settle and continue her career through her kind of key moments. And during this time period, the American landscape, which we've already seen as a huge component of art in the 19th century, is her major subject. Now, she's dealing with some of the same themes here, but she deals with them in an abstract way. This is a work that's called Black Cross with Red Sky. And here you've got, again, the pantheistic symbol of Christianity, of God, imprinted on, again, this world, the majesty of those mountains which are associated with the sublime, or this incredibly intense red in the sky, again, associated with the sublime and pantheism and all the power of God that infuses the universe. Now, in a way, that cross form, while being positive sometimes, meaning a positive form that we recognize as a cross, also because it's black becomes a negative form where in a way it almost recedes away from us, or it's the absence of red that creates the cross, as if beneath it all is this idea of some kind of generative spirit, maybe God, maybe something kind of more universal than that exists in the world everywhere. Or another way to put this is, imagine you're out in the landscape and you see a glorious sunset and you feel this like, oh my, there's something powerful, something divine out there. How do I express it? That's what she's up to here. Or scenes like this, and there are a million of these, by the way, show up all the time. This is a work that's called Stump and Red Hills. This used to be really difficult for me to explain. I'm old enough to have taught before The Lion King, but now it got really easy for me, if you've ever seen that, by the way. What we have here is a tree that it once grew. It was once full of life. One presumes it was green and big and powerful, and now it's died, and it's just this stump that's going to be reabsorbed by the mountain that is around it, or the hills that are around it. It's as if she's saying something about the kind of circle of life that we've already seen, going all the way back to Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire, where the essence of nature is things are born, things thrive and grow and live and prosper. Things then age and die and return to the earth so that new things can grow. And that is the essence of nature. That is kind of a very pantheistic idea about some core principle or generative, rational logic to nature. And you see it over and again in her work. I'm just showing you a few examples of this. Red Hills with Bones. So again, things live, things thrive, things die. their energy is returned. There's a, we all know this, there is an equilibrium of energy in the universe, even if it is dispersing since the time of the Big Bang. But here you've got those bones that at one point were something that was living and thriving. It has died, its energy returned to the universe, or returned to the earth. And in the background here you see flowers starting to grow out of the energy of that life form that once was. Or it works like this. And I'll just kind of leave you with a thought here. This is a work, one of my favorite, called the Lawrence Tree. It comes from an experience that she had where she was having dinners at her friends. This big, beautiful tree was there. She looked up through the tree at the stars and felt connected to the universe. I want to leave you with this thought. If you've ever looked at Van Gogh's Starry Night, in a way, this is George O'Keeffe's equivalent for it, right? We've all had the experience of looking up at the night sky through a tree at some point in our life, and that feeling of, wow, the vastness of the universe. This is the sublime in a way, right? The vastness, overpowering kind of breadth of the universe. It goes on forever by our standards. I mean, we can't even imagine its hugeness, how incredibly immense this is, right? How many stars there are and so forth. And yet we are connected to it all. And in this case, by that tree that looks a little bit like an umbilicus or a vein coming from us into the sky and snaking into that universe. We're one part of this vastness, right? So on the one hand, that exhilarating feeling of like a recognition of our place in this wider universe, and also that corresponding quality or feeling to the sublime of feeling minuscule in relation to that vastness. Now, I made a connection to Van Gogh's Starry Night. I'm thinking of this, for those of you who don't know, as a correlative taken from a different vantage point of his cypress tree in the upper left-hand foreground of Starry Night. And again, those changes of perspective that give you those qualities. I want to talk about this in a couple of different ways. This is Pelvis with Shadows and Moon, a later work from 1943. So she's down low in the desert, and it's the moon. And if you've never, by the way, been in the desert during a full moon, put it on your bucket list. It's a little bit like being in an area of the world where you get a full moon and it's snowy outside. And you get that really weird light. That's what the desert looks like. But of course, you're in the middle of nowhere, and there's all kinds of strange sounds and so forth that don't get deadened by the snow. It's worth seeing. So now you've got these strange inversions going on. She's put your viewpoint way down on the ground, looking up through these bones of a pelvis towards the moon and the sky. Right? So using that kind of things that she's learned from photography. It's got the same kind of symbolism in a way here. You've got something that was once alive that is now dead. You've got the idea of a moon. The moon is very closely associated historically with women's bodies and the cycles of nature and menses and so forth. So things that thrive and then die and then thrive and then die. Things that are the heart of, frankly, birth when it comes to life on Earth. So that part's there too. But then I just want you to look at this and think, if you're a formalist art critic and you don't care about what she's trying to communicate or express, how many of you can say, this is just a beautiful, really pleasing form? I really like the play of things that are positive shapes and negative shapes, things that are actual bones and things that are their shadows. The kind of repetition, for instance, of this white circular shape with this blue circular shape with the perfect circular shape of the moon, right? It can be all of those things at once, depending on which angle you look at it. The only thing that you have to worry about is ascribing to someone a particular intention. Like if you were to say, George O'Keeffe was just trying to create a beautifully, art for art's sake form, that wouldn't work. But if you said, from my standpoint, looking at this, I'm really responding to this as an aesthetic, right? It's just something that's a beautiful arrangement of form. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Or even more close up from her pelvis series, Red with Yellow. Same thing, looking through a bone from really close up at the sky. Another artist who did a lot of the same types of things, abstracted his forms but left recognizable forms, is Edward Hopper, although he's closer to the naturalistic side of things. He doesn't ever abstract anything as far as George O'Keeffe did. He's absolutely influenced by people like Edouard Manet and the Impressionist artists, particularly Degas. Degas, by the way, for those you don't know, did a ton of scenes that are very similar to what you'll see in Hopper, in which he played the role of the flaneur, which we barely talked about. So let me remind you that a flaneur in France was basically an independent kind of upper bourgeoisie man who could go out into the world, this changing world of 19th century France, feeling a little detached from it, and observe it and make comments on it or picture parts of it in his paintings that we would all look at and say, I wonder if this is about this or this is about that. Or another way to put this is they're kind of like amateur sociologists or glorified people watchers, job I would always want, by the way, where you just kind of look at things that are happening in the world and you say, oh, that's an indicator of this new thing. Kind of no-brainer ones. You go around campus when you used to be able to go around campus and you observe people doing this or that and you're like, oh, this is an indicator of everyone being in a screen culture, everyone pulling out their phones immediately when they leave a lecture or whatever it might be. Artists have been doing that through the Impressionist period, partially at the call of someone like Baudelaire saying, paint scenes of your modern life so that we can gain some access and think about what's going on in our world. He's influenced by that. And he's also influenced by trying to capture particular effects of light, as the Impressionist artists were, right? So trying to capture the quality of light. And he's absolutely trying to express his feelings about his modern world. So here, for instance, 11 a.m. from 1926, you see a very standard scene for Hopper, a nude woman, this is, usually the model is his wife, sitting in front of an open window, apparently unaware that we're there. And if there's one thematic you see in Hopper's work over and again, it's the voyeur. We get to be a voyeur looking in on someone who doesn't get to see us, in the same way that Degas did this all the time. And, of course, one of the things that he ties this to in the world is we now live in a world where everyone is very aware of being seen or looking at other people. Modern metropolises, of course, everyone is in the eye of everyone else. Everyone is constantly being seen and affecting how they look for those people that are seeing them. In this case, he focuses on a woman who's unaware of being seen, who's in this moment of intimacy to break through that feeling in a way. Now, he's also pictured her nude because he wants to show you has some understanding of anatomy. He's certainly interested in past traditions. But does anyone get the feeling that this is erotic to you? It doesn't feel that way to me. One of his most famous pictures is this one called The Automat. And it's a really good one to kind of analyze here. For those of you who don't know, an automat was a modern invention, a kind of new eatery in which you would basically buy your food from kind of vending machine types of situations. You didn't have to interact with anyone. It was a sign of technological progress, a sign of modernization, kind of quicker, more rapid food delivery systems. And in this case, Hopper's making a commentary, at least in part, on that. Like, what does it do to live in a new modern society with all of these changes? How does it affect us? And in this case, I'm just going to point out a couple of things. Of course, our main subject is a woman here, and there's little clues to what's going on, and you can pick them up. But she seems to be lost in thought, doesn't she? And the circle, starting with her coffee cup, and then the saucer, and then the saucer here, and then the table, and then the top of her hat, the brim of her hat and the top of her hat, are all things that close her into her space. They're all things that confine her in her space. In other words, everything circles in to her own kind of internal introspection. The chair is not pulled out for us to sit in. It's closed off. We're not invited into her world. No one else is going to sit here. She's not even taking off her coat. She's only taken off one glove. She's not going to be here for long anyway. In the background is the front window of the automat, which reflects what is basically in our space out here, which is a bank of lights going off into an indeterminate distance, also, as far as we can tell, empty. Now, what I see here is a kind of alienation, a very common thematic for modern artists that occurs in a modern society, which ironically is even more densely populated. But with that density doesn't come greater degrees of intimacy, but rather alienation. People don't connect in the ways that they do, let's say, in the proverbial small town. And I think all of us have felt this, right? You wander through a downtown area, and because there's so many people, you're even more anonymous than you would be if there were fewer people. And maybe these forms of technological progress, like, an automat, are also contributing to that feeling of isolation or disconnection between people. However, with that being said, there are a couple of other things to point out. They tend to be women, they tend to be pretty women, and they tend to be women that are associated with age-old tropes of being objects of desire. In the window here is basically a still life, a bunch of fruit that is supposed to be, I presume, an advertisement for people walking by. This is what you can get. That shape of the fruit is the same shape as her hat, and it's fairly closely identified with her. And if you know further that traditionally women, as we saw in some of our earliest lectures, will be associated with fruits or flowers as symbols of their fertility, fecundity, and sexual availability, this is something that someone like Edouard Manet might do in one of his works to rhyme her as an object of desire or an object of pleasure with the fruit that can also be consumed and be an object of pleasure. Finally, notice that the table, while disassociating you from her, disconnecting you or getting in your way, allows us to see her legs that are what we call fetishized. They're in a way detached from her body and become an object that we can look at, just like she's an object that we can look at. Now, along with saying all of that, I want to add again, just like George O'Keeffe's work, that for Edward Hopper, a lot of what he's doing here is also, in addition to being about expressing this state of a modern society, just simply about the arrangement of form in a really dynamic, balanced way. They're beautiful paintings. So you've got round forms against rectilinear forms, repeated forms against singular forms, gold over here in the turnstile that gets you up, picked up over here with the radiator, picked up again above here with the handle as well. Big, bold rectilinear areas of white versus that kind of chalky white of the tabletop, right? He's not just interested in telling you something or expressing something through the language that he's using. He's also interested in creating a really pleasing organization of form that is quite complex, in that it's not symmetrical, it's not balanced in standard ways, but is nonetheless, again, kind of harmonized in these differences. Just going to take you through fairly quickly a couple more of these. A big part of Edward Hopper's work, like Early Sunday Morning here from 1930, is about seeing something in the world and then recomposing it as a form that's going to create these kinds of abstract, very aesthetically pleasing, in this case, storefronts. So he's not trying to tell you what this looks like. He's using this as an occasion to, again, create this color against this color against this color, this shape against this shape down below, right? Yeah, it's based upon something that he's seen, but he's cropped it off, he's changed it and arranged it in a way that is just supposed to be, in this case, pleasing. It's just supposed to be an aesthetically pleasing thing to be looking at. Or gas here, same kind of thing. It's got a feeling of coming across a country gas station late at night, social isolation, that kind of feeling of being the only person in the universe. But the other part of this is just kind of beautiful form. And finally, because you'd all get mad at me if I didn't bring it up, The Nighthawks or Nighthawks here, one of those works of art that is likely just simply about this idea that we're all constantly being seen. This huge kind of corner diner, Phillies, where you get to see inside these people who are on display, like we're all in the fishbowl eye of the world, as they used to say, and social isolation. There are people in here, but there's very little in the way of interacting between those people. That seems to be all that he was trying to say, and yet the interpretations on this vary from murder is being planned to these are gangsters to lots of racial innuendo as well that may or may not have any validity. And there's a close-up to see that surface. Remember, by this point, you're not going to get a whole lot of accurate, really defined, like hyper-idealistic forms like you saw in classicism. These are artists that want to draw attention to the paint on the canvas. Finally, let's end here, and it's mainly as a setup for something that's upcoming in a couple of lectures. At the end of the 1920s, the Museum of Modern Art opens up. This is Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art, surrounded by some of his better purchases, right? He's the brains behind buying Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, for instance. I bring this up to tell you that, again, by the end of the 20s, right on the edge of the Great Depression, by the way, the first modern art museum really opens. But these artists that we've been looking at don't get supported by Alfred Barr. He doesn't buy a lot of their works. He doesn't put on a lot of exhibitions of their works. There are exceptions to this, one that you'll see in a moment. And the reason for that is that he firmly believed that while abstraction was maybe the most cutting-edge art form out there, and he bought, the right stuff, he thought it was something that Europeans were good at, and Americans were really on a different trajectory. That American artists were much more inclined towards realism, towards naturalistic representation. So he liked people like Hopper to some degree, and people like George O'Keeffe, who still had a degree of naturalism in their work. But he wouldn't buy the more extreme abstract artists, with a couple of exceptions. And what I'm getting at here is that at the moment in time that you might have had an infrastructure to support modern artists in the United States, it didn't really happen. One of the artists he actually, and by the way, I should just say this, Alfred Barr was a straightforward formalist. For him, all art had to do with the arrangement of form. This is his art history lesson, by the way. This is the way he thinks of art evolving. There's not anything in here that has any influence from outside art. It's just one art form looking at an earlier art form and responding to it, not influenced at all by historical context or anything going on in the world. One artist he liked to some degree, he gave him a couple of exhibitions, was Stuart Davis. And this is Stuart Davis's Swing Landscape. Now, Stuart Davis is on kind of that far end of the spectrum of abstraction and trying to express something about what he would feel about an environment. So in Swing Landscape, think of swing music, really energetic music, lots of rhythm to it, lots of changes in its cadence, like lots of dynamism, lots of energy, being corresponded with the energy of New York City, and him trying to create an abstract equivalent for this energy through this arrangement of form called the swing landscape, right? It's hard to recognize any individual thing, but you know that what you're looking at is something full of energy, lots of changes in different hues or colors here, lots of unpredictable arrangements of forms, things that are organic, things that are, geometric, and lots of diagonals and curvilinear forms, very little stability, right? Everything's off of axis. So obviously full of energy. But the big reason that I bring in Stuart Davis for a kind of introductory class in art history is to talk some about, this very short article that I gave you. And let me just pull up this quote really quickly if I can. Where did I put it? Sorry, here we go. So in that article I gave you, what I wanted to do is, before we move into regionalism and African American arts for a brief moment, I wanted to kind of put in the next lectures, I wanted to put a little bit of a kind of end cap on this discussion of modernism. And so we could come back to it, kind of bookmark it and come back to it when we get to abstract expressionism and the criticism of Clement Greenberg. And Davis is a perfect way to do this. Davis explains in that short article, again, a foreword to his exhibition, why, in his way of thinking, modern artists have turned away from accurate representations of the world towards something else. And he puts it in a key passage this way. Art is not and never was a mere reflection of nature. And he's right. It never was. I mean, I can't think of a single time, even those incredibly, it seems like, realistic still life drawings that the Dutch did, there's, it's more than that. It's about communicating something more than this is an accurate representation of something. Again, art is not and never was a mere reflection of nature. All efforts at imitation of nature are foredoomed to failure, right? You're never going to get it right anyway. Art is an understanding and interpretation of nature in various media. Therefore, in our efforts to express our understanding of nature, we will always bear in mind the limitations of our medium of expression. That's what I was saying when I said painters are saying, why would I try to create something that's illusionistic if I'm 2D? That's a limitation I can't get beyond. Our pictures will be expressions which are parallel to nature, and parallel lines never meet. We will never try to copy the uncopyable, but will seek to establish a material tangibility in our medium, which will be a permanent record of an idea or emotion inspired by nature. This being so, we will never again ask the question of a painting, is it a good likeness? Does it look like the thing it is supposed to represent? Instead, we will ask the question, does this painting, which is a defined two-dimensional surface, right? That's what it is to start, convey to me a direct emotional or ideological stimulus. Since we forego all efforts to reflect optical illusions and concentrate on the reality of our canvas, we will now study the material reality of our medium, paint on canvas or whatever it may be. The approach has become scientifically experimental. A painting, for example, is a two-dimensional plane, and the process of making a painting is the act of defining two-dimensional space on that surface. Any analogy which is drawn from our two-dimensional expression to three-dimensional nature will only be forceful in the degree to which our painting has achieved a two-dimensional clarity and logic. So just to end with this, last work for today's lecture, this is Stuart Davis's New York Mural, right? So obviously, right off the bat, he is saying, listen, you're not trying to make a likeness of nature. That's foredoomed to failure, and it's not really what art's ever been trying to do anyway. What an art form needs to do is start with, what am I at my essence? And for painting, that means a two-dimensional surface with form arranged on it, and continue to retain that reality of a two-dimensional surface while still defining it in relation to expressing whatever feeling or thought or emotion or experience you're trying to express. In this case, in New York City Mural, I think what he's getting at is, again, the metropolis of New York City with what looks like the Eiffel Tower in the background, big, huge high-rises, very dense space, all piled up on each other, but different by using different colors here. And then in the foreground, you see what looks like the China, what they would call the International District today, but Chinatown parade of various things kind of piled up on each other, moving through a space with crowds of people around it, or something like that, right? But on the one hand, we can recognize on the form as something that refers to a real cityscape and maybe a parade with various floats and so forth. And on the other hand, it's quite clearly a two-dimensional surface. It doesn't look illusionistically three-dimensional. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture. I know it was a fairly long one, but it's a very important topic, and we'll be moving in a couple of lectures to a little bit shorter lectures, and then, back to modernism when we look to abstract expressionism.